All right. Good evening, everyone. Thanks again for joining us this evening.
Facebook, yeah.
It's been a gorgeous pre-spring day, and we're glad that you guys were able to join us tonight. So my name is Jen Tremin, and I am with the Atlanta BeltLine Partnership. We are the nonprofit entity for the Atlanta BeltLine, and we put on programs such as the one you're joining us tonight, which we call our Home Empowerment Workshop Series. So what this is we partner with great nonprofits in the Atlanta area to talk about resources that are available to both homeowners and renters to help you be more secure in your home. So tonight we're going to hear from Atlanta Legal Aid on how you can save money on your property taxes by filing for homestead exemptions. Just a few things before we get started. You will be muted the whole time, but there will be a Q&A function. Just type your questions into that, and we will answer as many as we can throughout the session. If while you're watching or afterwards, you decide that you're eligible for homestead and you want a little bit more help with the filing process, we are hosting a couple of virtual consultations that are with one of us on the team or some volunteers. And those will be on March 10th at 10 a.m. I'm sorry, March 13th at 10 a.m. or March 24th at 6 p.m. And I will drop a link in the chat and email you guys later with how you can register. You will also get a survey from us after this. Please take a few seconds to fill that out. It really does help inform our programming. And then just one last thing that I want to share to help further your assistance with property taxes is a recent program we started in late 2020 that we're calling the Legacy Resident Retention Program. And this is for homeowners over on the South and West Beltline. If you're familiar with our jargon, that's sub area 1, 2, 9, and 10. And this is to help pay the increase in property taxes until 2030 when the project funding ends. So if you own your home and you're currently residing there and you've been there since 2017, check out our website to see the other eligibility requirements, and we'd love to get you involved in that program. You can find that website at beltline.org/retention fund, or you can shoot me an email and I'm happy to talk about it. That's Jennifer@atlblp.org. I will also drop those in the chat so you can reach out and we can talk more about that. And with that, I will turn it over to our friends at Atlanta Legal Aid. Stacey Reynolds will talk to us about homestead exemptions.
Hi, thank you. And thank you to the BeltLine Partnership for having us here. I'm Stacey Reynolds. I'm an attorney in our Senior Citizens Law Project at Atlanta Legal Aid. I also have Carrie King and Sarah Kelsey online with us to help try and answer questions and chime in as needed. But mostly you'll be listening to me. So let's get started. Well, there. So what we're going to be talking about today is the homestead exemption. And this is just sort of an outline of what we're going to do. We're going to start out with why is the homestead exemption important, who is eligible for it, what the deadline is, what kinds of exemptions are we talking about, what kind of proof do you need, the process for appealing and appealing the denial. The process for applying and then appealing the denial. So the first part is, why is this important? And we start out by looking at how are the property taxes calculated. So there's a value for your home, and it's the overall value for the true market value of your home is what they aim for. The part that they're going to tax on is only 40% of that, though. So in this example, the true value is $100,000, and then the taxable value is $40,000. So that's 40% of $100,000. From that $40,000, they then subtract whatever exemptions you're eligible for. So in this case, we're using the senior exemption for the basic senior exemption, which is $50,000. So you subtract that from $40,000, they're not going to give you a negative number, so it would be zero. You then take that number and multiply it by the millage rate, which is just a fancy word for tax rate. And that's how they figure out how much taxes are owed. In this case, it would be zero. Let's say it was 10,000, they would multiply 10,000 times the millage rate to get what your taxes are owed. So whatever you're subtracting from that 40% assessed value is going to save you money. So the question is, why is it important now? Or why is it more important now? So we can look at an example of home where the person is getting the full senior exemptions. She's over 70, the home's value is the same. She's getting these exemptions. In 2018, you can see what they did is they got the assessed value, which is the 40% value, minus the exemptions, and figuring out what the taxes are owed based on that. And you can see that she's already getting a huge benefit from these senior exemptions, zeroing out some of her taxes and reducing the others. So she's already getting a benefit. In 2019, though, they created what they call a floating exemption. And with that, her 2019 bill, with no other changes, she has the exact same exemptions, she has the exact same value. The bill for 2019 ends up being almost half what it was in 2018. So that's why this is important, because even by just getting the basic exemption, you're going to be able to get this floating exemption that's going to save you money over time. You won't see probably as big a savings as she did, because she was able to lock in the 2017 value, which you may remember was, artificially low in a lot of areas. So, so she really benefited a lot. But even now, it would keep your value from going up for most of your tax bill, and so that would, or keep it from going up very much. So it's going to save you a lot of money, and it's a really important thing to go on and get at least the basic exemption. And hopefully, if you're a senior or there are other exemptions that we'll talk about in a minute. You may have heard of the value cap. So when I say floating exemption, you're thinking, well, what about the value cap? Actually, they're the same thing. It's just a different way of saying the same thing. I actually had to do the math to figure it out. But what they do is they calculate the exemption to reflect the capped value. So the way the value cap works is that they cap you at a certain tax year, and then it can only go up at most 3% per year. And so what they do is whatever the value above that is, they add that to your exemption. But it comes out being the same thing as if they were using that value as your assessed value. So this is the property tax timeline. So this is what we kind of think of as the tax year. It actually goes a little bit into the coming year, because it takes longer for the tax appeals to be processed, especially if there's a pandemic, which makes it extremely long. But the part that we're focusing on today is really this one. We're looking at April 1st. That is the deadline for filing your homestead exemption. You want to be sure to remember that. If we were all in person, I would make you all repeat that back to me. April 1st is the deadline. If you file after April 1st, you can still get the exemption, but not for this year. It's not going to go into effect until the following year. So you have to file it by April 1st. There's also, to step back, January 1st is really the beginning of your tax year. And that is really when you have to be eligible for the homestead exemption. So if you bought the home on January 2nd, you're not technically eligible for the homestead exemption this year. It won't go into effect until next year. You have to be qualified as of January 1st. Just to run through a little bit real quick, after you get your homestead exemption application in, you may not hear anything until you get the notice of assessment. And the notice of assessment should reflect whether you got that homestead exemption. If it does not reflect that, then you're going to want to appeal that. The notice of assessment will also give you what they think the value of your home is. And if that's gone up and you don't think that's correct, you also need to appeal that. The hard part is that there's no set date. There's not like an April 1st set date for when the notice of assessment comes out. It could come out at any time. Usually it's sometime in May or June. And then from the date they issue it, you only have 45 days to put in that appeal. So you want to be sure to keep an eye out for those things and put in your appeal. We'll be doing another session somewhere around that time to try and help you understand what the notice of assessment is and appealing it. But just to sort of give you the overall, that's when you're going to need to appeal this. And it's important to remember that that is going to come out before you get your tax bill. So by the time you get your tax bill, you would have lost the ability to appeal any problems. So if you don't have your homestead exemption and you get your tax bill and suddenly it's higher, it's too late at that point to appeal it. So you want to be sure to keep an eye out for that notice of assessment. I'm going to move on. Who is eligible to apply? So the general mantra that we hear is that someone who owns their home and lives in it is able to get the homestead exemption. it's a little bit more nuanced than that. And I really want to push the envelope a little bit on this. It's really a bona fide claim to ownership in the residence. So a person who has a deed in their name, that's easy. They're definitely going to be eligible. You know, if they own the home, even if they own it with their 6 sisters, and the 5 sisters live somewhere else, they can still get the homestead exemption for that home. So that part's easy. The part's a little bit harder is when people have a different kind of home ownership interest. So a person with a life estate is still going to be eligible for the homestead exemption. A person with a contract for the purchase of the home is going to be eligible for the homestead exemption. A person who resides in a home owned by a parent who is deceased or incapacitated, even if the estate has not been distributed, is eligible for the homestead exemption. A person who resides in the home that he or she will inherit, but the home is being probated, should still be able to get the homestead exemption while that probate is going on. A person who resides in the home that is in a trust and the person residing in the home is a beneficiary under the trust should still be able to get the homestead exemption. And finally, the spouse of the homeowner who lives in the home is eligible for the homestead exemption unless their spouse is getting a homestead exemption somewhere else. So spouses are only allowed one exemption. Even if they own 2 homes, they're only going to be able to get the homestead exemption on one. And so, if they're separated, even if it's their primary residence, only one of them is going to be able to get the homestead exemption. So that's who's eligible. You also have to live in the home. Again, there are some exceptions to that, but they're fairly narrow. If you're out of the home due to health reasons, you're still eligible for the homestead exemption. So for example, if you have to go to a nursing home or something like that, then you're going to still be eligible for the homestead exemption, even though you're not technically living in the home at that point. If you're out of the home because you're in the armed services, you're still eligible for the homestead exemption. For 1 year after a horrible accident like a flood, fire, storm that makes the home uninhabitable, you're still eligible for the homestead exemption. This is the only one that's limited to just that time frame, because I think the goal is that you need to get the home fixed and get back into the home to keep getting the homestead exemption. And then the final one is if the homeowner's spouse or children live in the home, they can still get the homestead exemption even though the homeowner spouse is living somewhere else. So those are all things that you would still be eligible even though you don't live in the home. Again, the deadline is April 1st. Again, I'd make you all repeat that back to me if we were in person. You have to file by April 1st. Here, there's some very, very narrow exceptions. Most of them require you to actually have someone tell the tax assessor's office that you're not able to do it due to health reasons, or you're not able to do it due to service in the armed services, and the narrow exception for surviving spouses. But now, since you can file online, and so you can file from pretty much anywhere, I would say go ahead and file if at all possible. And then follow up as needed. The kinds of exemptions that you can get, I mentioned before, the basic exemption does include the floating exemption for a good part of your bill. So that's going to be an automatic benefit as the years go by and the prices continue to skyrocket. That will help keep your taxes more in line. And then there's also some even higher exemptions for people who are, as they age and become disabled in specialty circumstances. So as you turn 62, 65, or 70, you want to be sure to go back and reapply to make sure you're getting the higher exemptions that you would qualify for. If you're disabled, you can get some of those senior exemptions even at a younger age. If you're a disabled veteran or the unremarried spouse or minor children of a disabled veteran, you can still get the homestead, you can get a very good homestead exemption from that. And also the unmarried spouses of U.S. service members or police or firefighters that are killed in the line of duty can get these higher exemptions. Most of these do require some sort of income limit. and the income limit that they give sounds really low. Like one of them is $10,000, and who can really live on $10,000? But they don't count a lot of your income, so don't be thrown off by the low amount. If you're only getting Social Security, then you're probably going to be eligible for these senior exemptions and disability exemptions. If you are getting other retirement, a lot of that may also be discounted from the value. So you want to be sure to look into whether you're eligible, even if your income looks like it's above the limits.
Stacy, we've got a question about how often do you apply for this?
So once you've got the homestead exemption, you are supposed to keep it as long as you're eligible. You don't have to go back and reapply. There is one very narrow senior exemption that you have to apply for every 2 years. I think with the increased exemptions that they did a couple of years ago, I'm not sure how many people would be using that one anymore. But you want to be careful that if you are getting a senior exemption to ask whether it's one that needs to be reapplied. And they can ask you to come back and show, proof that you continue to be eligible for some of these. So, if they contact you, you need to respond and let them know that you're still eligible for it. And if you end up not being eligible for it, then you should notify them to drop the homestead exemption. So like if you move to a different house or something like that, you want to notify them that you should have it dropped.
Sorry, I'm seeing some questions generally about what happens if you live in a different county, like what are exemptions for my county. I did put in the chat a link to the Georgia Department of Revenue's page about homestead exemptions, which really highlights the statewide ones.
Yeah, and so some of these are statewide, some of them are specific to Fulton and City of Atlanta. Different cities will have also different exemptions. So you want to definitely look at your county. Usually your county tax commissioner or tax assessor's website is going to have the information about what exemptions they have. All of them are going to have some basic exemptions. All of them are going to have some senior exemptions, as well as the ones for the disabled veterans and spouses of service members and police and firefighters that have been killed in the line of duty. All of those are state exemptions. The amount of the exemption may be different from for some counties, because Fulton and Atlanta have higher amounts for some of these things than the state law requires.
And then we've got some more. Sorry, finish whatever you were saying, Stacy.
The exemptions for people who are disabled is not a state law one. And so that's one that's you need to check with your local jurisdiction to see if that one does apply. Okay,
we've got a good question about what happens if I buy a house with an exemption on it. Do I need to apply this year?
Yes. If you buy a house with the exemption, as soon as your deed gets processed, it's likely that they will drop the exemption. Now, it's based on whoever owned the home as of January 1st. So if that person had the home in January 1st and was qualified, that exemption will continue until the end of this year. But you should go ahead and apply as soon as you can, so that it's clear that, once it's time for it to be your exemption, that you've applied and it's yours. If you do not apply by the deadline, you have waived your right to the exemption for that year. So you want to be sure to get it in.
We've got another interesting one about what it means if you own a house and then co-sign on someone else for them to buy a house. Can both you and that other person have homestead exemptions on the separate properties?
Yes, as long as you're not married to that person, you can have separate exemptions. You're going to be eligible for the home in which you have it as your primary residence. So, and then that other person is going to be eligible for the home in which they have as their primary residence.
Right. So the key is that primary residence. Someone asked about if you rent out the home, and you can't do a homestead exemption for that.
Right. You have to actually live in the home.
Okay. Someone else asked, do I have to file a county exemption if my city has one as well?
Yes, because you're getting taxed by both the county and the city. So you want to be sure you're getting the exemptions for both jurisdictions. And we'll actually talk a little bit about that when it comes to applying, that you want to be sure to check with your city as well to see if you need to apply separately with the city.
And someone else asked this, and I know that we see this sometimes, that if they applied but didn't receive a response last year.
If you applied and did not receive a response last year, you need to check on it. If you applied by April 1st and you did not get, it didn't get reflected in your notice of assessment, technically that's when you need to appeal. But because such a weird year, I think they may be a little bit more flexible. So if you can show that you actually did apply by the deadline, you might be able to get them to process it. So it's worth at least checking on that. If you did it online, you can actually go back in to your online account and see what the status of that application is.
Okay, and we have a couple of people who kind of asked more of the details on what the millage rate is and how to do the calculations. Do we get, I think you have examples, right, of some of this?
Well, I had examples back at the beginning. I kind of hate to rush back through there, but so the millage rates are going to be set by the jurisdictions that are taxing you. So the three main things that are taxing you is going to be the county, the city, and the schools. And each of those may be broken down into subcategories. There are bonds and things like that. Each of those is going to have its own millage rate. And each of those taxing authorities is going to go through a process to figure out what that millage rate should be. And they're going to be doing that after the notices of assessment come out. So you want to be sure to pay attention to what your county and city are doing about what that millage rate should be. But they're going to be calculating what that tax rate should be based on what they need for their expenses. And they're going to be looking at what they think the tax rolls are going to look like. And it's this whole weird amorphous thing. But they all calculate what those rates are, and it's different for each line item on your tax bill. Does that help?
Stacey.
Mm-hmm. Anything else right now?
Nope, continue on. Thank you.
Okay. So these are the kinds of exemptions that you get. I just want to do a quick note that there are also a couple of tax deferral options for seniors, for people who are over 62, but they're very limited. They have very strict income guidelines. They also can only apply if the total amount that the property is encumbered is 85% or less. So if you have a mortgage, like a reverse mortgage or something like that, then they're probably not going to be willing to allow you to have that unless there's a lot of equity in the home. So, but there is that option. Okay, so let's talk about applying for the homestead exemption. The things that you need to bring in order to apply for the exemption is going to be your ID, the registration for all cars, or all vehicles that are owned by the applicant. And all of the vehicles must be actually registered at the home place. They're assuming that you're going to have your cars registered where you live. And so that's going to be an indication of your primary residence. You also are going to need any proof of ownership. If you have a recorded deed and it's already showing up in the system, you won't actually need to provide that. But especially if you fall into some of these other categories of a claim to ownership, you're going to need to have the documents to show that. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. For anyone applying for the senior exemptions, you're also going to need to show your income. So you're going to need to provide income tax returns if you file them. You're also going to need to provide the award letters for Social Security or other benefits that you're getting to show what your income is that you qualify for that, for those senior exemptions. For the other specialty, you're going to need to show, like if you're a disabled vet, you're going to need to show the VA disability letter. For disability, you're going to need to show a physician's disability form. So there are things that you're going to need to gather before you actually apply. And these are the basic things. So let's talk a little more about the ownership thing. So this is where I disagree with the county on a lot of these things. And I can see where they're coming from. There's a little bit confusing because there is a provision in the law that says that they want to see a recorded deed reflecting the actual ownership of the property. And so they read that as, well, it has to have a deed in your name. But then there are a couple other provisions that specifically talk about things that there's no way it requires a deed in your name. So I think that they're reading that wrong. I think that the deed showing actual ownership needs to be what you are linking to for why you should be eligible. So for example, if you're applying because your parent is deceased or incapacitated and you're living in the home, then what you need is the deed to your parent and then the proof that you actually are the child of that parent. Or if you're the spouse, you're going to need a marriage certificate showing that you are the spouse of the person who owns the home. So what you need is a recorded deed and proof that you actually link to that. Is what I believe. So what shows that? Again, the recorded deed in your name is just going to be automatically showing that you're entitled to the homestead exemption as long as you live in the home. But if you're in one of these other categories, you're going to need that recorded deed plus the documents that links you to it. So for example, the birth certificates, the death certificates, the probate records, a copy of the will. If you have a contract for deed, then you need the recorded deed to the person that's leasing you the home, like with a lease purchase option or lease to own kind of thing. And then also that lease. Also the trust documents. If you're in the trust, then you're going to need to have that to be able to show that you actually do qualify, even though you don't have technically the deed recorded in your name.
Hey, Stacy, we have a question coming in from Facebook Live. I will read it aloud. So this person bought a place late last year. It's a new development on a new street. Right now, there's not a parcel ID assigned online. The street name also isn't found when he searches by that. Who should be giving the parcel ID and how can we make sure it's done by April 1st deadline and it is within Fulton County?
That is a really good question, and I don't know the answer. I did not realize they would do a certificate of occupancy without having a street address. So I don't know the answer to that. Maybe take the information and we can try and get back to them afterwards.
We've got a couple more that are related. Do you know how long it takes for your name to appear as owner on a deed after you close?
Well, so there are two questions. One is how long it takes for the deed to be recorded. And so for it to appear in the deed recording records. And, Fulton County, when I would, take a deed into them and have it recorded, it could sometimes take, weeks for it to appear in the records showing that transaction happened. And you don't usually record the same day that you actually do it. So there's always that lag. Now with the online recording, you can actually e-record, and it seems like it's a lot faster that way. But it's still, you should assume there's gonna be a little bit of a lag. Then that information also has to be transferred into the tax assessor's records. And so sometimes, I'm not sure if they do that continuously through the year or if they wait until the January 1st to switch it over, to bring in all of the new owners from the prior year. And there's just also a lot of problems. They don't always do that. A lot of properties still stay in the old name. And so for the tax records, you're going to need to show your deed showing that you're now the owner.
Okay, so someone asked a good question. Doesn't the county already have my deed if they send me a tax notice every year?
Maybe. Ideally they do. Again, what they're doing is they're getting the information from the deed records. And if their system shows in your name, they probably will not ask for a recorded deed. So you can always try without having the recorded deed with you And then if you need to, come back with it. But if they have your name in the system, they're probably not going to ask for the recorded deed.
Mhm.
This is much more of an issue for people who don't have their name in the tax assessor system at this point.
And does someone need to provide proof of Georgia residency?
You're going to need to prove that you live in that home. So you're only going to be eligible for the exemption if it's your primary residence. So you're going to need to prove, you're going to need to have the Georgia ID, hopefully with that address on it. And if it doesn't, you may need to get it updated if you have time. If not, at least bring in, utility bills and things that show that you actually do live in that home.
Thanks.
Okay. So how do you apply? You can apply online, and if you just go to fultonassessor.org, go to online services, it'll take you to the smart file system to be able to apply online. The great thing about applying online is that you will get proof that you applied. You will be able to apply even if they don't think that you should be able to apply. And you have proof that you did it by the deadline. Now you need to be sure to go all the way through to the point where you hit submit before April 1st in order to be sure that that you have timely applied for the exemptions. Because if you don't actually hit submit, then technically you haven't applied. And there's a whole series of pages that you have to go through answering questions. And it includes a thing where you can upload the documents that you need. So like, a copy of your ID or a copy of the vehicle registrations, a copy of the income information. All those things can be uploaded, and you can actually come back to it and upload those things later. The downside of filing online is that, some people are just not as comfortable doing things online, or they don't have an email address, and you do have to have a valid email address to be able to set up your account for the online system. For people who are not as comfortable with the online, our workshops hopefully will help people with dealing with that. So be sure to look out for that. But if you can't file it online, you can actually apply in person as well. The one caveat is that, right now, a lot of these offices either are not open or are only taking people by appointment. So you want to be sure to call ahead to see if any of them, see what the rules are for this. And definitely don't wait until the last minute, because it's going to be really hard to get in just with all the COVID protocols going on right now. And the other problem with the applying in person is that they have a tendency to assume that if you don't qualify based on their reading of the law, they will not accept that application. And if you haven't actually applied, then it's going to be hard to be able to appeal it. So that's why the online, even if they don't think that you should be getting it, the online, you always show that you did apply. You want to be sure also, in addition to applying in the county, you want to be sure to apply for the city exemptions, which we mentioned earlier. City of Atlanta and a few others actually contract with the county and use the county exemptions. But some of the other cities don't. So you want to be sure to check with your city individually to see if there's any specialty exemptions that you might be eligible for and what the process is for applying for those. So again, if you're going to apply in person, you want to be sure that you have some sort of proof that you attempted to apply. If you applied successfully, they will usually give you a little slip of paper that says this is your new exemption. And so hold on to that so that if for some reason it doesn't get processed correctly, you have that proof that you actually did apply and got approved. If they think that you're not eligible, then they may not give you anything. So you want to be sure the offices have a sign-in system. So you want to be sure to sign in at the office to be able to prove that you actually did that, or do it online. So if you file your exemption online, you can get that application filed and have proof that you filed it, regardless of what they think of it, and process it. And the important thing for that is that it preserves your right to appeal it if they turn you down. If you get turned away from the office, feel free to give us a call. Again, I don't think they're supposed to do that. If you go in to apply, they're supposed to take the application. Even if they're going to deny it, they should take the application. And so if you have a good faith reason that you think that you should get it, if you fall into the categories that I've talked about, then apply, and then if they deny it, we'll get appealing it. Be sure to appeal that notice of assessment if it does not show your homestead exemption. A lot of times they're still processing these exemptions, so it may not appear even though they are going to ultimately give you the exemption. But if you go ahead and appeal it, then you can drop that appeal once the homestead exemption application is approved. But you just want to be sure to preserve that right. Again, you only have that 45 days from the date that the the notice of assessment comes out, not from the day you receive it. Even if you don't receive it, you still have that 45-day window. So you want to keep an eye out for that. Be sure to look at it. And let's talk for a minute about what the notice of assessment looks like.
Can I ask you a quick question? So someone asked an interesting question about if you purchase your home in January 2021, right? Then my understanding is to receive the homestead exemption, you would have had to own the house before that, right? By January 1st.
That's right.
So does it make sense for that person to go ahead and apply and just expect that it will apply the following year?
Yes, and that's no matter what time of year you buy the house, I always recommend that you go ahead and apply as soon as you can. It's not going to go into effect until the following year, but at least it shows that you have applied, because if you apply now, you've definitely applied before April 1st of 2022, which is really the deadline for people who bought the house now. So go ahead and apply for it. Again, if the person had the homestead exemption as of January 1st and owned the home, was otherwise qualified as of January 1st, their exemption is still going to be valid for this year. But you want to be sure that yours comes in right after that one.
And one that just came in, if you apply in person, will they tell you at the appointment that you got the exemption?
If you go in person, usually they will. If they actually are going to grant it, then they'll usually go ahead. Like I said, they'll give you a little sheet of paper that has the little codes for what exemptions you're getting. They may not be able to tell you exactly. They may still have to process a little bit, but they'll always be able to say, yes, you're going to be getting, the senior exemptions or whatever. And with that, you can feel pretty comfortable that you've got it. With the online stuff, you will have to wait a little bit longer for them to process it and send something saying that it actually was approved, because they have to go through and pull those applications and look at them. But if you're not, if you don't have a deed in your name, if you fall into one of those categories, a lot of times they just won't even take the application in person. And so it's kind of frustrating. And then also they'll want you to have all the documents. You want to be sure to have all the documents with you if you go in person, so that you can, do it all at once.
Thanks, Stacey.
Okay. So this is a sample of a notice of assessment. This one's a few years old, but they're pretty much the same every year. So I think it's a good illustration. And somewhere on here it says this is not a bill. And so a lot of times people just look at that and they think, well, it's not a bill, so I'm not going to deal with it. But it is actually an important document to look at and make sure that, whether or not you need to appeal it, because again, it's only 45 days from the date that they issue it. So the first thing I want to point out is the date they issued it. They actually will put on the notice the date that they issued it and the deadline for that appeal. So those two dates are actually on there. So you want to keep those in mind when you're looking at it, because even if you got it, much later than when it was issued, that deadline is still going to apply. You want to look and see what the exemption status is. If it says no when you apply for an exemption, then you need to appeal it. Again, if they're just processing it and it's going to be put in later, that's fine. You can drop that appeal. If it says HF01, that's the basic exemption. And if you applied for senior exemptions or other exemptions, then you want to appeal it because it's not giving you the exemptions that you applied for. Now, beyond that, beyond the HF01, there's a whole bunch of other codes that they use that are all for the different senior exemptions and other specialty exemptions. Those are going to be almost impossible to decipher. You can always call the tax assessor's office to ask them, what exemptions you're getting and make sure that you are getting the right ones. But you want to be sure to look on this notice of assessment to see if it's there and appeal it if it's not. You want to look at the value. They're going to show you what the value was for the prior year and then what the value is for the current year. And if the new value is going to be higher, you want to look and see whether there's a reason to appeal that. It's entirely possible that they've raised the value based on sales that are not comparable to your home. So you want to appeal it if the value is too high. The last thing you want to look at is this bottom part is a little sample of what you might expect from your tax bill. It's just an estimate. It is not the real thing. What they're doing is they're using last year's millage rates in order to show what the new value would do to your taxes. It should show, based on the exemptions and the new value, an idea of what your taxes are going to be. Keep in mind that, again, the cities and counties are in the process of setting those millage rates when this comes out. So they don't have the actual millage rate. So the actual tax bill could vary from this. But they're generally somewhat close to it. And it'll give you a little bit of an idea of, is this new value going to really cause your value to skyrocket, or your taxes to skyrocket? So it gives you a good idea of whether it's worth appealing. But you want to be sure to look at this. Again, you have to do the appeal within 45 days. So look at it quickly. If you need help, we will be doing more of these sessions around that time to try and help people who are appealing, are interested in appealing, talking through that.
Stacy, if the homestead exemption is like pending, if they're processing it, what will the document say?
It will say no. It doesn't have a category for pending. So and actually the other thing is that if it's based on a prior owner, then it may have that prior owner's name and the exemption will reflect the prior owner's exemptions. If there's any question on that, call the tax assessor's office to find out, whether it actually is reflecting your own exemption. And if the exemption that you applied for is not reflected there, appeal it. Does that answer?
Yes, thank you.
Again, the timeline, April 1st is our deadline, but keep in mind that, the rest of this tax year is going to be important. Once you've applied for the homestead exemption, keep an eye out for that notice of assessment, appeal it. Be sure that you recognize that you need to do that well before the tax bill comes out. So don't wait for your tax bill to decide, oh, wait, I need to do something. One advantage of if you're appealing the value and it goes to the Board of Equalization, you can get a 3-year freeze. So that can be a big tax savings. Again, we'll go into a lot more detail on that stuff in our sessions, probably in June of this year. But, all of this stuff is related to, how to be able to save money on your property taxes. So the last little piece that I've got is just a warning. If you do not pay your taxes, I want you to know what the process is. So again, with the tax year, at some point that tax bill is going to come out and it's going to have a deadline. And once that deadline passes, those taxes are past due. They'll start charging interest, they'll start charging fees. They'll issue a FIFA. A FIFA is just a fancy word for lien. And it's just to make known that you owe these taxes and they haven't been paid. Those liens could sit there for years. They could be transferred to third parties. And at some points, if you haven't paid them off, then the holder of the tax lien can levy on it. And what that is basically starting the foreclosure process. So like if they were repossessing your car, they would come and take your car, but they can't do that with a house. So what they do is they do a process called levy to make it known that they are planning on foreclosing on your home. And then they have to go through the foreclosure process with notices and publication and all that. And then they'll auction the tax deed off on the courthouse steps on the first Tuesday of a month. Once they get to that stage, it becomes so much more expensive. So it's just so important to pay this stuff well before you get to that stage. You want to be sure that you hopefully pay the taxes before the deadline or as soon thereafter to avoid any of this. Once it gets to the tax foreclosure, in order to save the home, rather than just paying the amount of the taxes and interests and penalties that are owed, you're also going to have to, you're basically going to have to pay the whatever was paid on the courthouse steps for the house, plus 20% of that price for the first year. And then any additional year, it's an additional 10% of that price. So typically people buying homes on the courthouse steps will bid up so that they can make sure they get a good return on their money. Either they're going to get the home or they're going to get this, 20% plus 10% for however many years return. They have to give you 1 year to be able to redeem, to pay that, the purchase price plus the redemption penalties. And if you don't redeem within that year, then they can start the process to foreclose the right to redeem. And all that is going through another notice process to let you know that you have a deadline. And it'll only give you like 30 days to be able to come up with that money. So you want to be sure that if there is a tax foreclosure, that you start working on that right away to try and get the money. People lose a lot of equity by letting the house go to a tax foreclosure. If you do pay the redemption amount, you get the title back. If they actually foreclose the right to redeem, at that point, they can evict you. So you want to be sure that you're talking to whoever is doing this so that you can hopefully arrange some way of either renting the house or finding a way to move out without having to be evicted. So that's the whole tax foreclosure process. Information about the appeals and things like that. Are there other questions?
There are a few other questions. First, I think we are going to just email out the PowerPoint. We've got a couple questions about that. So we do have the emails and we can email those out. So someone asked that about if their taxes are paid in escrow, do they need to respond to the bill?
Actually, so if the taxes are paid from the escrow, then they want to make sure that their mortgage company is actually paying those tax bills. Just confirm that they got it and that they're going to pay it by the deadline. But more importantly, the mortgage company is not going to pay attention to, the notice of assessment. They're not going to get that. So if the notice of assessment shows that the taxes are going to go up, then the homeowner needs to be the one to appeal that. The mortgage company doesn't care how much the taxes are. They're just going to charge that to the mortgage. So, they don't care if it keeps going up. It's the homeowner that really needs to keep an eye on that and make sure that they keep the taxes low so that once the mortgage company starts paying it, it's as low as it possibly can be.
Okay, and then we have a few more questions. So this one is from one of our legal aid brethren. So the scenario is that party A's spouse owned a home in the spouse's name only and had the homestead exemption, died in late 2020. The spouse had a will that left the house to party A. There hasn't been probate. Should party A apply for the homestead exemption now?
Yes. So the spouse is also entitled to the exemption. So one exception to the waiver is that a spouse who is entitled to the exemption should not be considered to have waived the the exemption. So technically, if they waited until the exemption was being removed, they should be okay. But I would still say go ahead and apply for it now, and go ahead and be doing the probate. Again, there are a couple of provisions that should allow for that person to get the exemption while the probate is going on. And so I always err on the side of applying to be able to be clear that you're not waiving the exemptions.
This one's a little bit different. So this person, when they started the homestead exemption process online, the search for their parcel returned with the previous homeowner's name as the property owner. So they were wondering, will that update when they file their homestead exemption? Are there some steps they need to take?
I would say contact the assessor's office. If it's a house where they purchased after January 1st, again, I'm not 100% sure that they update their system other than that sort of big, annual change. So it may not update. But I would call the tax assessor's office and ask that.
Okay, and then this is an interesting one. So this person asked whether it's always good advice to appeal the value of the house because they were told the higher the tax value is, the higher the sale value.
Purchasers are not going to necessarily go with what the tax value is. In some cases, the tax values are inflated. In some cases, they're too low. They're kind of all over the place. The purchaser, selling your home is going to go by what the market will bear rather than what the tax value says it is. So there's no harm in arguing for a lower value for the taxes and then hopefully selling for more. And the advantage, again, of appealing the taxes is that you can get that free. So even if you lose on the appeal, it won't go up for the next 2 years. So there's not really a harm to it. And it can save you money.
Yep, and we've got, I agree totally. We've got one more about just some questions about, again, the floating exemption, which I think is one of the most confusing concepts. How does it apply? Still a bit confused. I think it really is one of those really confusing concepts in this area.
It is, and that's why I try and so the value cap and the floating exemption are the same thing. And so for me, value cap makes more sense. So it's easier for me to think of it in terms of the value cap. So you lock in your value at a certain year with the floating exemption, and that's going to be your base year. From that base year, it can only go up as much as like 3% per year. And so that means that, again, let's say the house is worth $100,000. If it goes up 3%, then it's 103%. Okay, my math is horrible. Now I'm wondering if it's 103 or 130,000. But in any case, it's only going to go up 3%. But let's say that your market, the area that your home is in is skyrocketing. And so the houses around you that are similar are actually 200,000. You're not going to be taxed at 200,000 anymore. You're only going to go up that 3%. So even if the value that they come back with, in your notice of assessment is 200,000, that's not what you ultimately get taxed on for a big chunk of your bill. It is, however, how much you get taxed on for the bonds usually. There are some parts of your tax bill that will still use that new value. So that's why it's worth appealing it, even if you've got the value cap. But that's the way it works. And the floating exemption just takes that same concept, but switches it mathematically into an exemption instead of using that value. So it ends up being the same. And when you get the slideshow, you can look at the little math that I did to show that it really does come out to be the same thing. It's just a really weird way of doing it in my head. Other people probably, it makes more sense that way and not the value cap. But
yeah, the overall concept with these things is one of the things that was hard to get my mind around at first was that it's not about like the end number, like the percentages all apply to what this part of the value is. Like it gets confusing because of that. So you might need to review this. And like we said, it's recorded and we'll send out the PowerPoint too, so you can spend some time looking through it. I had one more question that just asked for proof of income. Can you use your federal tax return?
Yeah, and that's it. If you file tax returns, they're going to want to see that because there are some that go by the adjusted income based on your tax return. Some, and then there's some that go on a completely different calculation that doesn't appear on any form, and then some that that just subtract out a certain amount of Social Security. But they're going to want to see that tax return if you file one.
Great. I don't see any more questions coming through.
And perfect
I
time.
want to say one quick thing about the confusion of what applies to what. When you're looking at your tax bill, what you have to remember is that different exemptions apply to different pieces of it. So, you know, the general homestead exemption will apply to most of it. Senior exemptions will apply to some other parts. And so you'll see a lot of different numbers in there. It's hard to explain like exactly how to do that without, you know, looking at a person's specific situation. But if you go back to that screen where I have those, you can see a little bit of how the exemptions are different for different categories.
One thing that I did, I answered it in the Q&A box, but I think you might be able to answer it in a broader way. So a person asked about the exemption being retroactive because they've lived in their house a long time. And I said, in short answer, no, it's not retroactive.
So as I mentioned, if you don't apply for the exemption by the deadline, you have waived your right to the exemption for that year. So until you actually apply for it, you've waived all those years. You're entitled to the homestead exemption, but you only get it if you apply for it. So it's not something that they can retroactively apply. Now, the danger is that they do sometimes retroactively remove the exemption. So if you're getting an exemption based on a prior homeowner and they discover that that prior homeowner is no longer there, they may go back and remove that for the current year and the 3 years prior. So that's why I say, go ahead and apply. If you have a basis for getting the exemption, go ahead and apply and get the exemption. You don't want to waive it. Are there any other questions?
Oh, we did get one more. So this person wanted to clarify that we only file this exemption once. I don't need to file every year I live in the home.
Right. Yeah. These exemptions do last. Again, they may ask you to reprove some of the things. So, you may need to show your income again or things like that. But especially as you age, you want to go back, at 62, 65, 70, and any changes in your income. You want to go back and apply to see if you get any additional exemptions anyways. But they should continue without having to do anything else. You don't have to reapply, except for the one that you have to do every 2 years. But that's more and more rare now, I think. So, just double check that you're not getting one of those.
And you talked about this a little bit, but with the different ones for counties and cities and stuff, do we just have to be careful to make sure that it's not one of those we have to reapply for?
Yeah, and I would clarify with when you're applying for it, I would clarify that this is not one that I need to reapply for. Vast majority of them do not require reapplying. I'm not familiar with a lot of the smaller city ones, or especially the newer city ones. Some of those may have deadlines, but most of them really go with we don't need to reapply. So they don't want to process them either.
And then this last one was asking about one application for city and county, which I can say, no, you're going to need to apply for those separately.
Yeah, I mean, some of them will use the Fulton County information to apply the homestead exemption, like City of Atlanta does that. So you don't have to do anything else, but check with your city to see, because some of the cities do require that you do it at the city, especially for the senior ones. A lot of times you'll have to actually deal with the city directly for getting those, and it's worth doing.
All righty. Well, we're right at 7. So thank you to our presenters for that great information. And thank you to all of you for your time. I did put in a chat the reminder for those consultation sessions, the link, if you want some extra help filing later in March. You should get the recording automatically if you register, but we'll send that out again with the slides, and I'll include that link again so you have it all in one place. And just a reminder to do the survey if you have a couple quick moments. And other than that, thank you again for everyone's time. And I hope you all have a great evening.